two general organizing frameworks that you can use when you analyze psychological research. Now, the next question that we can ask ourselves is, what is special about psychology as a science? Because obviously not all of this, but most of these sources of information that we mentioned are available also to people in their everyday life. Everyone has a consciousness and everyone looks at each other's behavior, and we also make some inferences about people's mental processes. So what is special about a scientific study of human mind as opposed to everyday inferences that people make? Obviously, there are different criteria of science. In different textbooks, you can find different lists of criteria of science. But I think 4 of them are most important. First of all, a scientist wants to arrive at some truth, at some generalizable knowledge that would apply to many different situations, to many different individuals, and then we can say this knowledge is trustworthy. Maybe it is some truth, some true information about human mind. Of course, we can be aware that absolute truth is unattainable if we are postmodernists and we think that every truth is relative, but at least we try to verify our knowledge. As opposed to some everyday observations when people just want to have some information to explain the situation. They need some simple explanation to just get rid of the problem. Science is not happy with that. The second criterion is that we try to solve problems using systematic approach. We try to combine all the information that is available to us, all the existing information, and also our research is always based on all the preceding studies in science. When a person is making everyday observations of people's behavior, they're usually naive with respect to all the other knowledge that is accumulated. And when philosophers were trying to make some observations about humans, each of them also developed their own theory based on their own subjective experience. But of course, when we develop our research as scientists, we try to basically go on Scopus or Web of Science or Google Scholar, and we try to look at all the existing studies that have focused on our research question so that we can gather together all the information that is accumulated before us, and we try to make a next step in developing it. The third criterion, which I think is very important, is that our scientific results are validated by our scientific methods. When a person makes everyday observations, they might just ask another person, or they might just make some spontaneous, fragmented observations of behavior, but this won't work as a scientific evidence. Because if you want to gather some scientific evidence, you need to use some scientific method. For example, you conduct an interview which has a certain interview schedule and which has certain criteria of what makes a good interview and how to analyze the transcript of an interview in order to make sure that the findings that you get from the interview actually reflect what a person is really thinking and saying, rather than reflects your impression of that person. So that's basically what a scientific method is. And our methods are validated by theories. For example, if you do a psychological questionnaire, there is always some underlying psychometric theory, which makes a scientific questionnaire different from just a popular test that you can find online for entertainment, for example. And of course, our theories are based on our philosophical assumptions. Always in the end, there is philosophy. And the fourth criterion of science that is also very important, we aim to arrive at reproducible results. If I conduct a certain study and I get some new interesting experimental effect, I try to describe all the stages of my experiment in such a way that another person could replicate my experiment and could arrive at hopefully the same results. Maybe the effect would be weaker because of different conditions, but at least the effect should be replicable. And maybe you have heard about such a thing as replication crisis. It's a very popular topic that has gathered a lot of hype recently, when people have now, thanks to the developments in the scientific methodology in the past 2 decades, people have become much more critical with respect to studies that were conducted in the past and that are now considered classical studies. You can find them in all textbooks. But when people actually try to replicate these experiments, they find that actually many of these experiments do not really replicate. These experimental effects either don't exist or the conditions to create them are so special, or maybe people have changed and now these effects don't replicate anymore. So there are many different explanations. Some people say that researchers were so lousy that they engaged in poor research practices or questionable research practices, whereas other people say that just humans have changed and maybe those effects do not really hold as well as we expected them to hold. So we aim to arrive at results that would be replicated by other people and that would be supported by consensus of a scientific community. That's why there is peer review, and whenever you find some information about some psychological process, of course it makes sense to ask, does this come from a peer-reviewed source? Does this come from a good journal where there was an editor and at least a couple of reviewers who also gave a thought to this research paradigm and who tried to make sure that this finding is based on some really good validated methods and there are no questionable research practices and so on. So basically, the validity of our findings is based on a certain consensus of a scientific community. And here we come to the very important notion, the notion of a scientific paradigm. This notion was introduced by Thomas Kuhn in 1950s approximately, and he defined paradigm as the whole set of practices that define a scientific discipline at a certain point in time. So basically, the paradigm of psychology is a common idea, a common view shared by all people who claim to call themselves psychologists, who have a degree in psychology and who publish in psychological journals. And this is a common view with respect to the following questions. What do we study? What questions can we ask? What kind of methods do we use? And what kind of theoretical ideas do we use to interpret our results? So there are clearly some questions that are outside the paradigm of psychology. For example, the question about God. I can ask this question. It's a very important, relevant question, but I cannot ask it and I cannot resolve it using psychological methods. This is basically not part of psychological paradigm. It is maybe part of theology. But in psychology, I can only ask a question, what do different people think about God, or how do different ideas about God affect people's behavior? What kind of images of God do people have consciously or unconsciously? And there are some interesting studies about it. But the question of God himself is outside of our scientific paradigm. And with respect to some other phenomena, the question is also open. For example, extrasensory perception or precognition. Do people have an ability to make guesses about events in the future before these events actually occur? And do people have the ability to foresee things? This question of extrasensory perception and precognition has been studied by psychology from since the 19th century, but still this question is kind of open because no one has managed to replicate these findings in such a way that scientific community would actually trust these results. Not so long ago, Daryl Bem, a very famous social psychologist, has published in a very reputable psychological journal, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, a paper where he published 9 experiments, where basically he claimed to have shown these effects of precognition, that people are able to guess stimuli before these stimuli actually occur. But then, and of course, reviewers did not find any problem in this set of experiments. But then some other people, when this paper was published, some other people started to scrutinize his studies. And they found that actually things are not so clear, because probably when he just started his research, he picked some experiments where his where the results that he wanted to see appeared, and he did not even record the results of those experiments that he considered failed when the result that he thought did not appear. So when people started to replicate his findings, it emerged that actually this effect does not replicate. And as a result of this whole discussion around his paper, now we have much more stringent rules with respect to how we should conduct our research. For example, that we should record and publish all stages of our research, even the series when the effect didn't work. And we should ideally pre-register our research before we conduct it. So we should describe what steps we shall take, and then when we do our research, we should take these steps. Yeah, so there is also the evolution of psychological paradigm. Some research approaches that were completely okay during the 20th century, for example, try several different methods and see which one works and then publish. This was okay in the 20th century. In the 21st century, this is considered a questionable research practice, because now we know that when people do it, it results in effects that cannot be replicable, in effects that actually do not work. So the question is, what defines a psychological paradigm? Thomas Kuhn believed that psychology does not have a paradigm at all. But there are also different points of view. Some people say that psychology has many paradigms at the same time, or some people say that psychology is not a kind of science that is expected to have a paradigm. So my quick heuristic answer to this question would be, if you want to understand what is the paradigm of psychology right now, just look at the journals of American Psychological Association. What kind of questions people ask in their papers, what kind of methods do they use, what kind of theories do they use to interpret their results, and then you can get a kind of general idea of what kind of paradigm does psychology have. But right now, we'll take a quick look at the evolution of scientific paradigm in psychology. Basically, what kind of paradigm